In 1875, a team of 121 men ventured deep into the northern wilderness to run a secluded logging camp. But when winter finally broke, only 9 returned, exhausted and haunted. The rest had simply disappeared. For years, whispers of sabotage, buried tunnels, merciless weather, and corporate cover-ups filled the air. Now the real story is ready to be uncovered. Journey with the crew from their first step off the steamboat to their harrowing fight for survival in the frozen wild. As the camp descends into chaos and the forest tightens its grip, the truth behind their fate begins to emerge. The journey to the end. Logging is often tied to the legend of Paul Bunyan, the towering woodsman with his blue ox Babe. But beyond the folklore, the truth was far from mythic. Logging was a vast, grueling, and deeply complex industry. If you were alive in 1875, chances are you knew someone who worked in the logging camps. It was the golden age of timber, when forests were fortune, and men risked their lives to feed the hungry engines of a booming nation. Axes rang through the air, saws screamed across oak and pine, and rivers carried millions of logs south to feed cities rising from steel and smoke. The loggers were the muscle behind it all. Men who lived rough, worked harder, and earned just enough to send home a letter and a promise. Most made between $25 and $40 a month, if they lived to collect it. They worked 6 days a week, cutting trees tall as cathedrals, using little more than grit, calloused hands, and the new miracle tool of the day, the crosscut saw. But behind the booming industry and the roar of falling timber was a truth few talked about, a truth that began with a single trip upriver. In the winter of 1875, 121 men boarded a steamboat bound for a remote northern forest, and by spring, only 9 would return. The river was gray with morning mist when the steamboat docked. The air bit like steel. Dozens of men clambered down the gangplank, boots thudding on the frozen mud. Crates of food, barrels of water, and stacks of saws and axes rolled onto waiting wagons. A hard-eyed foreman barked orders over the chaos. "Keep it moving, boys! We've got a long way before sundown." That was Samuel Hodgage, lean, wiry, and worn to the bone. His voice could have sanded wood. He had run plenty of camps before, but never one this far north, where the trees grew older than towns and winter never really left. At his side walked Thomas Bell, a quiet man in his 30s with a lean face and the kind of hands that told their own story. He had worked 3 camps already, survived a landslide in Michigan, and once lost 2 fingers to a saw. Still, something about this place felt different. The forest here didn't just surround you, it swallowed you. Beside him trudged William Grant, 22, all nerves and hope, grinning through the drizzle with his axe slung over one shoulder. He muttered something about the long stretch of trees ahead, certain they were in for a challenge. Thomas gave a half smile, thinking how the place felt like the very edge of the world. They followed the wagons inland, wheels creaking, boots sinking into the wet leaves. The deeper they went, the quieter it got. No birds, no wind, just the dull groan of trees shifting under their own weight. By dusk, they reached a clearing by a wide bend in the river. A handful of rough cabins and a cookhouse stood crooked in the mud, smoke curling from one stone chimney. It looked like a town that hadn't decided whether to live or die yet. That first night, the men crowded into the mess hall, wet, hungry, and already questioning their choices. Loggers, often called lumberjacks, tended to return to familiar camps each winter or follow a favorite cook wherever he went. In those days, a cook could make or break a camp. If the food was bad or the cook unpopular, the men wouldn't hesitate to pack up, find work elsewhere, or simply never come back. And this particular one was a no-nonsense cook. The cook, a broad-shouldered man with a sour expression, ladled out beans and salt pork. Hodgage stood at the head of the room, his coat dripping and his voice rising above the scrape of tin plates. He announced that work would begin at dawn, with the felling crews taking the east slope first. The logs were to be driven downriver by February. The quotas were steep, but he promised the pay would be worth it for those who kept their heads down. The men murmured their assent, tired but hopeful. Thomas, though, kept glancing toward the windows. The forest outside pressed close to the glass, black and silent. Somewhere in the distance, something howled, long and low. It might have been wolves, or maybe it wasn't. That night, as the fire died down, he lay awake on his cot listening to the creak of the walls. The sound of the wind slipped through the cracks, whispering like someone breathing against the boards. Morning came hard, frost coated the logs, and the men's breath hung thick in the air. But once the first axe struck wood, the camp came alive. Axes bit deep, saws screamed, commands echoed through the pines. Horses strained at harnesses, dragging felled giants toward the river. The rhythm of labor took over, one that left no room for thought. "Timber!" someone would shout, and the forest would shudder as another trunk slammed into the frozen ground. By midday, the men were soaked with sweat despite the cold. Laughter cut through the air, rough and nervous. For now, everything felt almost normal. Still, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He paused between swings, scanning the tree line. The woods stretched forever, shadows moving between the trunks. He squinted and, for a moment, thought he saw a flicker of light far off, like a lantern swaying in the distance. When he told Hodgedge later, the foreman just grunted. "Probably trappers," he said, though his tone carried no conviction. Days passed in a blur of noise and exhaustion. Cabins rose, fires burned, and the smell of sap and sweat filled the air. The men found their rhythm, but the forest never felt any less strange. Sometimes, when the sun dipped low, it seemed the trees leaned closer, crowding the camp's edge. Even laughter around the cook fire carried an edge. At night, the mist returned. It rolled in off the river and slid between the cabins, thick and white, until you couldn't see the man beside you. Some said they heard voices in it, faint, almost human. Others dismissed it, saying that it was the wind playing tricks on their minds. Thomas didn't know what to believe, but he knew one thing. The farther they went, the harder it was to tell where the forest ended and the fear began. On the seventh night, Thomas woke to the faint glow of lanterns flickering through the fog. They moved slowly, weaving between the trees, too many to belong to trappers. He sat up, heart hammering. Then, as suddenly as they appeared, the lights blinked out. By morning, there was no sign of them. When he mentioned it over breakfast, the others laughed, part nervous, part mocking. One of them joked that the woods must have wanted to say good night. But Hodgedge didn't laugh. He just stared into his coffee, silent. For a week, everything went according to plan. The trees fell, the logs floated, and the men kept their heads down. But the forest had plans of its own. Started with the small things. For a while, there was just little noise here and there and the music of the camp. Axes biting into pine, saws whining in tandem, the thud of logs rolling down ramps slick with frost. Shouts, laughter, the clatter of tin plates in the mess tent, the kind of steady motion that makes a man forget he's miles from anywhere. Then the small things began to go missing. At first, nobody cared much. A crosscut saw disappeared one night, a brand new one, still sharp enough to shave bark clean. Hodgedge grunted and waved off the complaint, insisting that someone must have misplaced it. But when a crate of nails disappeared the next morning, the rumors began to spread. The cook swore he had locked the storehouse before turning in. By daylight, the latch was open, not broken, and his voice trembled like a lantern flame as he tried to explain it. The men argued. Theft, prank, plain forgetfulness. No one owned up. Then Thomas found the footprints. He had gone down to the river before dawn, steam rising from the black water. And there they were, bare feet, small like a child's, leading from the river into the trees. He called William over to take a look. William frowned, squinting at the ice, and guessed it might have been a trapper who had lost his boots. Thomas shook his head, unconvinced. In weather that cold, it didn't make sense. They brought the matter to Hodgedge, who glanced up from his ledger just long enough to snort and dismiss it. They weren't there to chase ghost stories, he said, and told them to keep their eyes on the trees, not the shadows. The men obeyed, but something in the air shifted after that. By dusk, they worked longer hours, as if motion alone could fend off the unease creeping through the camp. By night, conversation dwindled. Then came the first real disappearance. 4 men went upriver to mark new stands of timber. They were due back by dark, but when they didn't return, Hodgedge sent out a search party. The next morning they found the skiff drifting downriver, empty except for an axe and a torn glove. There were no bodies, no footprints, only churned mud and broken branches. The rhythm of the camp faltered. At meals, spoons scraped against tin in uneasy silence. Even William, usually the joker, had stopped smiling, worried that 4 of them had gone like smoke without any explanation whatsoever. Thomas told him they would turn up, but the words rang hollow to his ears. More went missing after that. Harris, the bunkhouse worker, vanished on his way to the privy. 2 horses broke free and bolted into the forest. They never came back. Rumors sprouted like fungus, drifters in the woods, a cursed valley, old Indian burial grounds. No one said it out loud where Hodgedge could hear, but everyone thought it. The foreman pushed the men harder, reminding them of the contract that bound them all. They were to finish the season, get paid, and that was the deal. But the crew was coming apart. They began locking their bunks and hiding their rations. Fights broke out over scraps, over missing gloves, over nothing at all. One night a brawl erupted over a pair of boots. Hodgedge broke it up himself, fists flying, blood splattering onto the snow outside the bunkhouse. He swore the camp would not turn into a madhouse. They would stay, work, and finish the job. That was the night the cold changed. Heavier, as if the forest itself was pressing in. A few days later, Thomas and William were hauling logs across the river ice with 2 others when it gave way. The ice screamed, split apart, and swallowed one of the men whole. Thomas scrambled back, soaked and gasping, but Carter was gone. By nightfall, the campfire burned low, and no one spoke above a whisper. Thomas sat by the flames, shivering despite his dry clothes. He told William they had to leave. William stared into the firelight, his face hollow, and said Hodgedge would never allow it. Thomas affirmed that he wasn't asking for permission, as something had to be done. But they both knew it wasn't Hodgedge keeping them there. The forest hemmed them in, endless, white, and waiting. The nearest town was 2 days' hard travel through knee-deep snow. Without supplies or a guide, it was suicide. So they stayed, worked by day, listened by night, and waited for the next thing to disappear. But then the sickness came and took everything else. Despair in the air. Hope, already stretched thin by hunger, began to tear apart completely. Despair didn't arrive with a scream. It crept in quietly, like the cold that leaked through the cracks in the cabin walls. They had woken up and found frost forming inside the windows, the breath of sleeping men frozen mid-air. The fires never seemed hot enough anymore. The coughs came next, low, dry, and constant. Then fevers. By morning, the camp sounded less like a work site and more like an infirmary. Bowls sat empty. The cook stopped keeping count of how many mouths he fed because half the time the men couldn't stomach what little there was. The smell of rot began to mingle with pine smoke, a reminder that the forest was claiming more than just trees. No one said the word sickness out loud, as if speaking it might give it strength. But it didn't need words. It moved freely, drifting from bunk to bunk, clinging to blankets, to hands, to the thin air they all shared. At night, the men used to gather by the fire, swapping stories, playing cards, laughing loud enough to keep the wolves away. Now the fireside gatherings faded. They still lit the flames, out of habit more than comfort, but nobody talked. The only sound was the wood crackling and the occasional cough that made everyone flinch. The camp felt smaller somehow, though the forest around it hadn't moved an inch. And then James fell sick. James, the one man everyone looked to when things started sliding sideways. He was built like an ox and spoke like a preacher, always telling the others to hold fast. That spring would come, that the company would send help. If James said it, they believed it, until the fever took him. At first he brushed it off. "Just the cold," he said, sweating through his shirt. But soon he couldn't stand, couldn't eat, couldn't keep his eyes open for more than a few seconds. The men took turns sitting by him, placing damp cloths on his forehead, spooning broth between cracked lips. His survival became a kind of prayer, unspoken but shared by everyone. But disease doesn't bargain. After 2 long weeks, James's breathing slowed to a rattle, a wet, hollow sound that silenced the whole bunkhouse. Then it stopped. For a moment nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Hodgedge, the quiet one, pulled a blanket over James's face and whispered something too soft to hear. They buried him beneath the frozen soil, hacking at the ground with axes meant for trees. The dirt was so hard it rang like iron. When the grave was done, someone muttered a prayer. Someone else cursed the company. That night the fire burned lower than ever. If James, strong, steady, unshakable James, could fall, what chance did any of them have? After that, the sickness didn't just live in their bodies, it lived in their minds. Men avoided one another, afraid the air itself was poisoned. Meals were eaten in silence, if eaten at all. The bunkhouse smelled of sweat, smoke, and despair. Hodgedge kept things moving, tending to the sick as best he could. He wrapped wounds with torn shirts, whispered prayers over the dying, tried to believe it meant something. "Kindness," he said once, "is the only medicine we've got left." But even kindness couldn't stem the tide. By February, more than 30 men were gone, buried, burned, or vanished into the woods to die alone. The camp stank of sickness and sorrow. Some men stopped working altogether, sitting by the river for hours, watching the ice drift by like they were waiting for it to take them, too. Others turned to drink. They raided the last barrels of whiskey meant for trade, drinking until their faces turned red and their voices hoarse. The next morning they'd lie half-frozen in the snow, not caring if they ever woke. The foreman, once loud and iron-fisted, grew quiet. His voice had lost its edge. When men asked what to do, he just stared into the distance, as if the forest might whisper an answer. It never did. Resentment replaced fear. "We were sent here to die," one man said. "The company's not sending help. Not now, not ever." The others didn't argue. They just nodded, hollow-eyed. One night, as a blizzard howled outside and snow piled against the doors, Thomas lay awake listening to the wind claw at the walls. Someone coughed weakly in the next bunk. Someone else muttered a prayer. The fire had burned low, the last coals glowing red like dying eyes. He turned to William and whispered that it felt like the forest's waiting for them to quit. William didn't answer. He was staring at the frost creeping across the window pane, a delicate lace of ice closing in inch by inch. A ghost town. By November, the camp wasn't just dying, it was already dead. Cabins stood half-buried in snow, doors swinging in the wind. Inside, bunks still held blankets, boots, and tin cups, as if the men had simply stepped out for air and never come back. The cook slept with a pistol now, the barrel resting beside his pillow. He said it was for wolves, but everyone knew better. The place had gone quiet in a way that made your ears ring. No axes, no laughter, not even the rhythmic thud of falling timber. Just the moan of the wind through hollow chimneys. Hodgedge still tried to keep order, or at least the illusion of it. His face had gone gray, his beard matted with frost, but he barked the same orders every morning. The men obeyed out of habit, not belief. Even as he shouted, his voice shook. The fear had finally caught up to him. You could see it in his eyes, wide and wet, darting to the tree line every few seconds. Thomas and William stuck together, saying little. They were hauling logs across a ridge one afternoon when the ground suddenly gave way. There was a hollow crack. Then the snow beneath them sagged and dropped. They leapt back just in time as a chunk of earth collapsed, revealing a dark wound in the ground. A black shaft gaped beneath, 10 feet wide, framed with splintered timbers. The smell hit them first, a mix of rot, rust, and something else. Something old. Thomas crouched at the edge, peering down. Wooden beams, half-eaten by decay, ran along the walls. Old rails glinted faintly at the bottom, half buried in sludge. It looked like a mine, William thought, his breath catching in the cold air. Thomas didn't respond. His eyes had fixed on a scrap of blue cloth snagged on a beam. William's voice broke as he recognized it. It was Harris's shirt. They ran back to camp, stumbling through the snow, breathless with cold and dread. When they told Hodgedge, the foreman froze for just a heartbeat before his jaw tightened. He ordered them to stay away from it, saying they had enough trouble without chasing ghosts underground. But Thomas caught the flicker in his eyes, a flicker of recognition. That night, while the wind screamed outside, Thomas sat close to the fire and whispered to William that it wasn't ghosts haunting them, but the land itself. Old shafts, sinkholes, and abandoned mines riddled the ground. The company had known the place was unstable. That was why the pay had been so high. William went pale, realizing they weren't workers at all. They were bait. Outside, the forest groaned. Snow slid from the roofs with heavy thuds. Somewhere in the distance, something metal clanged. Deep, faint, like a bell struck underwater. The men heard it too. They froze, staring at the walls as though silence could protect them. Then, from far off in the woods, came a scream, long, human, and then nothing. No one went looking. Not anymore. The next morning, 2 cabins stood empty, the bunks still warm. By week's end, a storm rolled in, swallowing the horizon whole. Snow didn't fall. It poured, thick and relentless. The wind howled like something alive. One cabin collapsed under the weight, killing 2 men. Another slid downhill in the night, swallowed by a landslide of ice and mud. When morning finally broke, the camp was gone, buried beneath heaps of snow and splintered timber. Thomas clawed his way out of a drift, coughing and blinded by the glare. The clearing was unrecognizable, just mounds where cabins had been, bodies half buried in snow, limbs jutting out like broken branches. William stumbled up beside him, face blue with cold. They stood together, shivering, staring at the ruins of everything they had built. The mess hall still stood, barely. Inside, a handful of survivors huddled near a dying fire, their faces hollow and gray. Hodgedge was there, eyes bloodshot, and in one hollowed breath he announced that they were leaving. Anyone who could walk was to follow him. Thomas counted 19 men left out of 121. He didn't ask about the rest. No one did. They packed what little food remained, wrapped themselves in blankets, facing the hardest way back home. Hard way back. Snow swallowed everything. Behind them, the camp was gone, buried like it had never existed. The wind didn't howl anymore, it hissed, low, constant, and cruel. 12 men stumbled forward through waist-deep snow. Their coats were stiff with frost, their breath ghosts in the air. Thomas could no longer feel his fingers. William trudged beside him, coughing into his sleeve. Behind them, Hodgedge muttered under his breath, urging them to keep moving. No one answered. They were long past words. By nightfall, one man froze standing up. The others found him still clutching his axe, a look of surprise frozen on his face. They didn't bury him. They didn't have the strength. They just walked on. The forest creaked and groaned around them, heavy with ice. Every sound felt alive, branches snapping, the soft thud of snow sliding off a limb. Somewhere in the distance, something moaned, deep and hollow. No one dared ask what it was. When they stopped to rest, it was only for minutes at a time. Men sank to their knees, breathing raggedly. A few wept quietly, though no tears came. It was too cold for that. Thomas's mind drifted between exhaustion and a strange calm, with William's hand clutching his coat, keeping him tethered to the living world. By the second day, their food was nearly gone. What little they had A handful of dried bread, a scrap of jerky, was rationed brutally. Hodgedge kept the bag close, counting each crumb like gold. When Thomas handed over his last piece to William, the older man weakly shook his head and told him to keep it. Thomas gave a faint smile and said that William would need it more. They moved like shadows through the snow, following the frozen river. At times they couldn't tell if they were still walking or simply drifting forward by instinct. One man vanished during a rest. His tracks ended at the riverbank. No splash, no sign of struggle, just gone. The group stared for a while, then kept walking. No one even spoke his name. By the third night, hope felt like a distant rumor. Thomas's vision blurred at the edges. His boots were torn. The snow burned against his skin. Then, through the fog of exhaustion, he saw something, thin gray smoke rising beyond the next ridge. "Smoke!" he croaked, pointing. The others barely reacted until he shouted again, "There! A cabin!" They stumbled toward it, tripping, crawling the last few yards. The cabin stood crooked but whole, its chimney puffing faintly. When Thomas kicked the door open, the blast of warm air nearly made him cry. Inside was a stove still warm from coals, a stack of dried meat, and a keg of frozen water thawing near the fire. The 9 men that's left collapsed on the floor like broken marionettes. Some laughed, others sobbed. Thomas fed William tiny strips of meat until color returned to his face. Someone lit more wood in the stove. The fire crackled, and for the first time in weeks, silence didn't mean danger. They stayed there 3 nights. They slept in shifts, afraid the storm would come for them again. But the snow outside softened, the wind dying down to a whisper. On the second night, Thomas woke to find Hodgedge sitting alone by the fire, eyes hollow, hands trembling. The light painted deep shadows across his gaunt face. He said quietly that they had left them all there, buried under the snow like dogs. Thomas couldn't bring himself to respond. Hodgedge let out a weak laugh, sharp and brittle like splintering wood, and muttered that it had all been for nothing, a paycheck that would never come. Thomas stared into the fire. The meat tasted like ash now. Relief had curdled into guilt. The warmth of survival only reminded them how cold the others must still be. Even after they escaped the forest, the shadows of that place followed them. The flaming hope. On the 4th morning, the silence broke. First a distant hum, then a sharp whistle slicing through the cold air. A steamboat. For a second, no one dared believe it. Then William's cracked voice whispered, "They found us." The men stumbled from the trapper's hut, waving their arms, shouting hoarsely across the white expanse. The sound of that whistle was like a miracle. The boat slowed, men calling out from the deck. A rope was thrown. Hands, warm, alive, pulled them aboard one by one. Thomas was the last to climb on. He turned back to the forest where snow drifted lazily between the trees. Somewhere beyond those shadows lay the camp, frozen and silent, swallowed whole. He felt no joy, just a hollow ache where relief should have been. On board, the crew wrapped them in blankets and handed out steaming bowls of broth. The men ate in silence, the warmth burning their throats. The steamboat carried them south, past miles of ice-choked river, through mist that made the world feel unreal. When they reached the nearest town, the survivors were herded into a boarding house turned infirmary. Doctors examined frostbitten hands and gangrenous feet. Townsfolk gathered outside to glimpse the miracle men who'd walked out of the frozen wilds. Reporters arrived next, notebooks in hand and eyes sharp with curiosity. One of them asked what had happened out there. Thomas started to answer, but a man in a black overcoat stepped forward first. A company man, smooth voice and polished shoes. He explained that it had been a hard winter, a tragic accident, and that the men had done their best. Then he smiled, sealing the lie with practiced ease. The reporters scribbled down his words, satisfied, as the truth disappeared beneath the company's polished version of events. Later that day, more company agents arrived. They handed out envelopes, small sums for hardship. They took down statements but never looked anyone in the eye. Each conversation ended the same way. "We're terribly sorry for your loss, but let's not dwell on unpleasant rumors." Unpleasant rumors. That's what the deaths of over 100 men had become. Thomas and William tried to tell their story to the local paper, to anyone who'd listen, but doors quietly closed. The paper ran a single column buried beneath grain prices. Logging camp disaster, few survivors, no mention of the hidden shaft, no mention of the strange noises in the night, or the way the company's maps never showed what lay beneath that forest. Hodgege vanished within a month. Some said he'd taken a train west. Others whispered he'd drowned himself in the river. No one checked. As the years passed, the story faded. The company changed names, merged, and disappeared into history. Thomas married, raised a daughter, and tried his hands at farming. But the winters always brought back the dread, the smell of smoke, the sound of wind through empty cabins. William never recovered. His lungs were ruined by frost and sickness. He soon succumbed to his ailments. In old age, when his hands had grown too shaky for farm work, Thomas began to write. Not for fame or vindication, just to set things right on paper, even if no one ever read it. He wrote about the footprints that appeared after dark, the missing tools, the shaft that breathed decay, the snow that didn't fall but devoured. He wrote about Hodgege and how survival had felt less like deliverance and more like punishment. When he finished, he tied the pages together and sealed them in a wooden trunk, telling his daughter that one day someone should know what really happened. And when Thomas passed, the trunk was tucked away, forgotten, gathering dust in an attic while history told a cleaner, safer version. Decades later, one woman opened a trunk, and what she found rewrote everything they thought they knew. The hidden truth. It began in dust and silence. Ellen Ward wasn't looking for ghosts, just history. She'd spent years digging through archives, piecing together forgotten settlements and lost industries. But one rainy afternoon inside her late grandmother's attic, she found something that would consume her for years. A wooden trunk, brass hinges half rusted. Inside, a bundle of faded papers tied with twine. On the first page, scrawled in neat, trembling handwriting, were two initials, T.B., Thomas Brant. The name meant nothing to her then, but the words beneath it did. They sent 121 men into that forest. Only 9 came back. For weeks, Ellen pored over the yellowed pages, letters, crude maps, fragments of logbooks from a long-dead logging camp. The handwriting changed as the pages went on, steady at first, then shaky, as though written by someone running out of time. The story that unfolded was grim, but what caught her historian's instinct was the pattern. Mentions of shafts, collapsing earth, missing tools, breathing ground. None of that matched any official record she could find. So she dug deeper. In the library archives, she found company ledgers stamped Halloway Timber Co., dated 1875. Tucked inside one ledger was a memo marked Confidential. North site unstable. Old mining tunnels beneath. Proceed with caution. Expedite operation before rival firms arrive. They had known. Ellen read on. Letters between foremen, receipts for explosives, medical reports listing pneumonia, frostbite, and unknown causes. There were even records of earlier settlements in that same valley, families who'd disappeared decades before the logging camp was ever built. It wasn't a mystery born of ghosts or curses. It was greed, pure and simple. The company had gambled with men's lives to beat the competition, and lost. Months later, Ellen packed a small bag, a camera, and Thomas Brant's notes, and set out for the north. The trip took her through miles of forgotten forest where the air felt older than time itself. By the third day, with the help of the maps she found in Thomas's trunk, she found it, or what was left of it. Moss-covered mounds marked where cabins once stood. Rusted iron tools lay half-buried in the soil. The river, once the camp's lifeline, had shifted course long ago, leaving a scar of dry gravel behind. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No birds, no wind, just the creak of old trees that shouldn't have been standing anymore. Ellen walked slowly, tracing the lines on Thomas's maps with her finger. She found where he'd written James's cabin in the margins and burial pit, frozen ground. The air there felt colder, somehow heavier. She crouched by a dark patch of soil and brushed it with her glove. Something blue caught her eye, a scrap of cloth tangled in the roots. She reached for it gently. It crumbled to dust in her hand. A soft breeze rustled through the branches, and for the faintest second she thought she heard it. A cough, distant and hollow, carried by the wind. Back home, Ellen turned her findings into an article. She listed all 112 missing men by name, citing company memos, maps, and excerpts from Thomas's journal. The piece ran in a regional magazine, made small waves for a week, then vanished under new headlines. The truth had surfaced only to sink again. History, it seemed, was more comfortable with mysteries than accountability. Thomas Brandt never lived to see her work. He died decades earlier, leaving behind a family who never knew the full story. Ellen's article ends quietly, almost like a whisper. This story seems like the stories of the men who lost their lives or went missing during the 1870s. Succumbing for the greed of companies who were too eager to tap into the riches of the forest, ignoring the dangers lurking beneath the cascading branches. No one kept a proper count, but the forests of 1870s America swallowed more men than history remembers. Logging was booming and deadly. Camps vanished under snow, men were crushed by falling pines or lost to fires like Peshtigo's Inferno. Records were sparse, reports buried under profit and sawdust. Some never came home, their names lost with the rivers that carried their logs. What remains are whispers of danger and ambition, the price paid for building a nation out of trees. Do you think the full truth about what happened to those men will ever be uncovered? What's your take on this? Share your perspective in the comments section. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.